In 2004, the Motorola RAZR V3 was the most desirable object in consumer electronics. It was thin beyond what anyone thought a phone could be, just under 14 millimeters, a number so improbable for a functional mobile phone that the engineering team had to develop entirely new manufacturing techniques to achieve it. The RAZR was made from aircraft-grade aluminum and cut using processes originally developed for military hardware. It felt like something from the future that had arrived slightly ahead of schedule. Celebrities carried it, fashion magazines photographed it. At its commercial peak, Motorola was selling a RAZR every 3 seconds somewhere on Earth. In 2006, the company posted revenues of $35 billion. 2 years later, the company that had built the RAZR was in financial freefall, losing hundreds of millions of dollars per quarter, watching its market share collapse from 22% to less than 10% in less than 24 months. And in 2012, Google acquired Motorola Mobility for $12.5 billion. 18 months after that, Google sold it to Lenovo for $2.9 billion. The company that had invented the mobile phone, that had defined what a mobile phone could look like at its cultural apex, had been bought and discarded by a search engine company for a loss of nearly $10 billion. Motorola was not a consumer electronics company that stumbled into mobile phones. It was the company that invented them. On April 3, 1973, Martin Cooper, a Motorola engineer, stood on a New York City sidewalk and made the first handheld cellular phone call in history. He called Joel Engel, his counterpart at AT&T's Bell Labs, and told him he was calling from a personal, handheld mobile phone. Cooper later said that Engel's response was silence. The silence of a man who understood, in real time, that the competitive landscape of his industry had just changed irreversibly. That 1973 moment established a brand identity in mobile communications that would sustain Motorola for 3 decades. The decades between that first call and the RAZR era were years of genuine technological leadership. Motorola produced the StarTAC in 1996, the world's first clamshell mobile phone. A device so compact compared to what had come before that it seemed to belong to a different category entirely. The StarTAC sold approximately 60 million units and established the clamshell form factor as the aspirational design language of mobile phones for the following decade. The Apollo lunar module's communication systems were Motorola technology, meaning the first words spoken from the surface of the moon traveled through Motorola hardware. The company's engineering culture was deep and serious, oriented toward physical performance milestones. It was the culture of people who measured success in millimeters, grams, and signal strength. That culture produced extraordinary hardware. It would prove structurally unsuited to what the mobile phone market became after 2007. The RAZR success of 2004 to 2006 deserves specific examination because it explains both the height of Motorola's achievement and the precise nature of the cognitive trap that achievement set. The engineering challenge was real. Building a fully functional phone in a form factor that thin required solving problems that had no existing solutions. New antenna designs, new hinge mechanisms, new manufacturing tolerances, new materials. Motorola sold 130 million RAZRs between 2004 and 2006, generating approximately $50 per unit in profit on a device that initially sold for significantly more. The company's market share, which had been declining, recovered dramatically. The problem the RAZR created was not financial. It was perceptual. The RAZR's success convinced Motorola's leadership that extreme focus on physical design innovation was the formula for ongoing success. When the RAZR began to age and competitors released their own thin phones, Motorola's response was to try to build a better RAZR, the KRZR, the SLVR, the ROKR. Each a variation on the original, each attempting to extend a product cycle the market was already moving beyond. The ROKR, developed in partnership with Apple and released in 2005, was meant to add iTunes Music capability to a hardware-first product. Steve Jobs later described his frustration publicly. The ROKR had been compromised by Motorola's unwillingness to subordinate the phone's hardware architecture to the music experience. Apple's relationship with Motorola ended with the ROKR. Apple proceeded to build the iPhone. On January 9th, 2007, Jobs walked onto the Macworld stage and introduced the iPhone with deliberate precision. He said Apple was introducing three revolutionary products: a widescreen iPod, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. Then, he said they were all the same device. The auditorium responded with sustained applause that greeted the recognition of something genuinely new. The engineers and executives of Nokia, Motorola, BlackBerry, and every other mobile phone manufacturer on Earth were confronting the same reality simultaneously. The product category they had been competing in had just been redefined by a company that had never made a phone before. The new competition would be conducted on software, user experience, and ecosystem, dimensions on which every existing mobile phone manufacturer had severe structural disadvantages relative to a company that had spent a decade building the world's most admired software-driven consumer products. Motorola's response was not swift or coherent. The company's leadership initially treated the iPhone as a niche product, a premium device for a small segment that appreciated design, priced to limit its commercial reach. The iPhone launched at $499 with a 2-year contract, significantly exceeding what most mobile phone users were paying. The early iPhone lacked capabilities Motorola phones had carried for years: no MMS, no third-party applications, limited enterprise email support. What it offered instead: a seamless touchscreen interface, a mobile web browser that actually worked, a music player integrated natively, addressed needs that professional mobile phone users had not known they had until they saw them demonstrated. The iPhone did not immediately take Motorola's market share. It immediately took Motorola's future. Android arrived in 2008 as a potential redemption story. Google's open-source mobile operating system offered hardware manufacturers the software ecosystem the iPhone had demonstrated was essential without requiring them to build it themselves. Motorola partnered with Google and Verizon to produce the Motorola Droid, launched in November 2009 with a significant marketing campaign explicitly positioning it as the iPhone alternative. The Droid sold over 1 million units in its first few months. The problem was structural. Android was available to every hardware manufacturer simultaneously. Samsung, HTC, LG, and dozens of others were building Android hardware and competing on processor speed, screen resolution, and application availability. Dimensions on which Motorola's manufacturing heritage provided no particular advantage. The market that rewarded thin aluminum had been replaced by a market that rewarded software integration. Sanjay Jha, who became Motorola's co-CEO in 2008 after the company split its businesses, committed Motorola's mobile strategy entirely to Android. The decision was strategically correct. Android was the right platform for a hardware company that lacked the capability to build its own software ecosystem. But the execution was inconsistent. Motorola produced dozens of Android devices across multiple price points and form factors, fragmenting its engineering resources across a portfolio that lacked the concentrated excellence of its best historical products. The RAZR brand was revived as a marketing label for several Android devices, trading on the equity of the original without reproducing the engineering achievement that had created it. None of these devices achieved the cultural moment the RAZR had created, because cultural moments in the smartphone era belonged to software ecosystems rather than to the hardware that ran them. By 2011, Motorola's mobile business was generating losses that made its long-term viability as an independent company questionable. In August 2011, Google announced its intention to acquire Motorola Mobility for $12.5 billion, a premium of approximately 63% over the stock price at the time. The acquisition rationale presented to the market was primarily about patents. Motorola held approximately 17,000 patents related to mobile technology, and Google, whose Android device manufacturers were being threatened by patent litigation from Apple and Microsoft, needed those patents. The description was accurate. It also obscured the secondary possibility that Google believed Motorola's hardware capabilities could complement Android's software excellence in the way that Apple's integration had proved to be its defining competitive advantage. Neither thesis produced the returns the acquisition price implied. Google retained operational control of Motorola Mobility for approximately 18 months, during which the business continued to generate losses. The patent portfolio proved less valuable than projected. Many patents were encumbered by existing licensing commitments or less relevant to the specific litigation threats Android faced. The hardware business did not produce the software integration breakthroughs that might have justified the premium. In January 2014, Google announced it would sell Motorola Mobility to Lenovo for approximately $2.9 billion. Google retained the majority of the patent portfolio, approximately 2,000 patents transferred to Lenovo, while Google kept the bulk of the 17,000, making the effective transaction price for the hardware business considerably lower than even the headline figure suggested. The acquisition that had cost $12.5 billion had produced a hardware business worth less than $3 billion and a patent portfolio whose strategic value had proved more limited than the investment thesis required. The loss on the transaction was approximately $9.5 billion before accounting for operating losses during the ownership period, one of the largest single acquisition write-downs in the history of the technology industry. Under Lenovo's ownership, the Motorola brand survived, producing a series of budget and mid-range Android smartphones under the Moto G and Moto E product lines. The Moto G received consistent critical recognition as one of the best budget smartphones available, but the business Lenovo had acquired was not the Motorola that had defined mobile communication for 30 years. It was a mid-market Android manufacturer competing in the most commoditized segment of the smartphone market, without the engineering culture, the brand equity, or the cultural relevance that had made the RAZR a defining artifact of its era. The trajectory of Motorola is sometimes described as a failure to see the smartphone revolution coming. That description is partly accurate and partly misleading. Motorola's engineers understood, well before the iPhone was announced, that mobile phones were becoming software platforms. The company participated in early smartphone operating system development long before Android existed. What Motorola failed to understand was not the direction of the market, but the implication of that direction for its own competitive position. In a hardware-defined market, Motorola's engineering culture was the competitive advantage. In a software-defined market, that same culture became a constraint, not because it produced bad hardware, but because it oriented the company's strategic thinking around dimensions that were becoming less important rather than around dimensions that were becoming more important. The RAZR's success made this cultural reorientation harder rather than easier, because it provided confirmation that hardware excellence remained the primary competitive dimension at precisely the moment the market was shifting away from it. The companies that navigated the smartphone transition most successfully were either already software companies, Google with Android, Apple with iOS, or hardware companies that subordinated their hardware identity entirely to the demands of a software-defined experience. Motorola was neither. It was a hardware company that tried to extend its hardware competitive advantage into a software-defined market, and discovered that the extension was not possible at the speed the market required. The RAZR's success had been built on the premise that the object in your hand was the product. The iPhone demonstrated that the object in your hand was increasingly just the vehicle for the product, and the product was the experience the software created inside it. Motorola built extraordinary vehicles. It never learned to build the experience that made the vehicle worth caring about in the new era. If you want to understand which companies today are still competing on the dimension that mattered in the previous era of their industry, optimizing for hardware in a software world, for distribution in a direct-to-consumer world, for scale in a quality-differentiated world, that is exactly what I track in my newsletter. Distressed debt analysis, leveraged finance, and the structural signals that precede the moment a company's competitive advantage becomes a competitive liability. The link is in the description. And if you want to see what happens when another company discovers that the dimension on which it built its advantage is no longer the dimension the market is competing on, click the videos above.